This is part 6 of my series, Legend of Zelda with Psychology and Philosophy. In this episode, I want to talk about the dark worlds of the Zelda series. But first, let me clarify what I mean by dark world. The titular dark world first appeared in A Link to the Past, being a wilder, more dangerous mirror realm attached to the ordinary version of Hyrule, also known as the Light World. But for the purposes of this video, I'll actually be grouping numerous locations, themes, events, and concepts under the umbrella term Dark World, even though the term is not canonically correct for games other than Link to the Past. In this context, a dark world is a situation, a realm, or even a state of mind within the Zelda series, which is contrary to the status quo and is notably distorted, unkind, forbidden, misleading, chaotic, or otherwise highly entropic. Lastly, a dark world is also very difficult to leave. Something about it is either very compelling, convoluted, elusive, or contagious to the point of being nigh inescapable. Such dark worlds manifest in numerous ways within the series. Sometimes it's a mirror world, or a kind of opposite world. Sometimes it's an alternate universe or a secret wonderland. Or even a dark or apocalyptic setting within an otherwise benign system. The dark world could also be described as a dark age or a dark timeline. But probably the best way to describe a dark world is a harmful reality or state of affairs, the likes of which might envelop an entire kingdom, or specific regions, or even certain subsections of the population. These dark realities are typically brought about by metaphysical means, and are usually, whether directly or indirectly, the result of greed, despair, wrath, or profound insecurity. But it should be noted that the dark world, in its unadulterated forms, is not an inherently evil place. It is rather portrayed as an ultimately sacred, meaningful, and even necessary location. The dark world is, after all, part of the light world, and cannot ever truly be separated from its so-called light counterpart, for they're bound eternally, whether by the gods, by the annals of time, by the powers of the Triforce, or even the player's own deeds. In certain instances, the Sacred Realm and Dark World are even described as being one and the same, the Sacred Realm functioning as a kind of reflection of the thoughts and actions of mortals on the other side. In some ways, the process could be described as a kind of reaction to a crisis, which is, for all intents and purposes, divinely imposed, meaning that, for better or for worse, this lower world, in all its various permutations, is woven into the very fabric of reality. Always present, always a possible outcome. But the other world isn't necessarily dangerous in of itself, beyond its volatile and abstruse nature. Regarding said natures, as far as the gods are concerned, humans do A in one realm, humans get B in the other. It's nothing personal. I should also note that these things are frequently described as being part of a cycle. It usually begins with a kind of golden age, wherein the mortal beings are virtuous, in that most of them are at the very least kind-hearted and peaceful, although most are also highly sheltered and therefore vulnerable. More often than not, the mortals either take such comfort for granted, thereby rendering themselves utterly inept, or stumble headfirst into peril as a result of their own curiosity, or a mix of both. So, when evil inevitably returns, most are brutally unprepared, and thus ushers in the Dark Age. Now, as I've mentioned, the alternate worlds and timelines in the Zelda series tend to reflect this state of affairs, and vice versa. But it also goes a little bit deeper than that. Because the Dark World isn't just a physical place. Indeed, the physical and psychological states of those dwelling within the Dark World are presented as inextricably linked. And woe to those who find themselves trapped within such a realm. But let's talk about that for one moment. What is the dark world in the psychological sense?
Chances are, you've been there before. You might be in the dark world right now, because it's a place we all go. It closely resembles our own lives, except everything is just a little bit off, and a little bit more difficult. Now, one may have already deemed things difficult in one's own world, but in a realm increasingly filled with shadows and illusions, well, even minor obstacles can feel insurmountable here. One's surroundings and circumstances alike might seem distorted, alien. Everything requires more energy, planning, and vigilance. The rules are confusing. Nothing makes sense anymore. The people might also seem a bit off. One may find it harder to relate to them. Perhaps they seem uncharacteristically mean, or overly simplistic, predictable, shallow, or in some extreme cases, altogether hollow. One might feel utterly alone in this world, always an intruder, always the odd one out. Or one may even find that one no longer recognizes oneself. Indeed, too often we meet the worst versions of ourselves in the dark world, and we also tend to perceive the worst in one another, since here we're forced to encounter all that which is neglected, stagnant, inadequate and defective, externally and internally alike. Though some may ultimately find peace in such an existence, for many, the dark world ultimately spells a lack of spirit, which is, in Zelda terms, a lack of courage, wisdom, or personal power. At its core, I personally believe that the dark world also represents, among other things, the reduction, disintegration, corruption, obfuscation, and submersion of ideas, thoughts, emotions, and perhaps especially identity. All of which, of course, induces suffering, whether on an individual level or a societal level.
This is a painful lens through which to view reality, but ultimately a necessary one, for the gods work in mysterious ways.
It is from within these dark realities that Link, ultimately anyway, acquires his strongest abilities, and, in a manner of speaking, becomes the best version of himself. This is in part because the otherworld transforms whomever it touches. Now, initially, it rarefies their weaknesses, their quirks, their mistakes, their hang-ups and obsessions. And indeed, most can neither comprehend, let alone withstand such darkness, and are thus trapped in a state of anger, paranoia, longing, regret, sorrow, or are otherwise rendered inert, at times even unaware of their predicament. However, some are better prepared, and this is not always a good thing. For example, the villains in the Zelda series sometimes transform the otherworld and are transformed by it willingly, wielding its powers with intention. At that point, the other reality, temporarily, becomes a literal breeding ground for evil, in which ordinary citizens live in constant fear of violation. Of course, for Link and most others, this all seems pretty bleak at first. But the Sacred Realm has various ways of repairing and correcting itself, and in the process also correcting and repairing the Light World.
Which, as I've implied, is a very significant aspect of the Sacred Realm.
As seen in many of the titles, once this evil has been granted sufficient time to fester, the atrocities begin. And it's around this point that the gods usually step in.
This is also where Link comes in.
It's through the player that the gods may heal, revive, or transform a broken or otherwise doomed realm. It takes strength and insight to endure the darkness. But above all, it requires courage. This is why, aside from the villains, who accrue power and resources by deliberately deforming the sacred realm, typically only Zelda, Link, and a select few spiritually advanced beings may achieve any real measure of control within its bounds. The gods in their time of need therefore call upon these most valiant of souls, right at the crucial moment. But call upon them to do what exactly?
Or to put it another way, what really frees us from the dark world?
Well, one thing's for sure. It involves a little bit more than simply vanquishing the villains. In fact, at times it requires just the opposite. While it's true that Link saves the day primarily by traveling through monster-infested dungeons, the games sort of imply that it's through small, everyday acts of kindness that the realm is ultimately freed of evil. It is through the people he helps along the way, as well as those who help in kind. It is through words of encouragement, through acts of humility, compassion, and forgiveness. It is through generosity and through sacrifice. In fact, it is these very actions, more often than not, that enable the heroes and heroines to understand and navigate the very darkest corners of the realm in the first place. The Dark World is cruelty and separation. The Dark World is aversion and marginalization. And it is, thus, through moments of love and unity that these realms are healed and reintegrated. A process which, typically, begins within the self. Link, Zelda, and the sages initially enter the Dark Worlds helpless, broken, and disintegrated. But once Link has healed by awakening unity within himself, he may then begin the process of awakening and healing others, whose own connection with unity, in turn, may spread yet further. In time, perhaps, closing the gap between the self and the other, between the in-groups and the outcasts, allowing for a much deeper resilience at a societal level.
And this spells the beginning of the new cycle, the next golden age in Hyrule.
The Dark Worlds in the Zelda series are ripe with symbolism, some of which I've also covered in previous episodes of the series. I mean, these kinds of underworlds just lend themselves so well to interpretation on so many levels. But this video was meant to focus on what I feel is an underrepresented component therein. When does the otherworld cease to be a malicious reality? Well, this is what I think, and this is of course just my interpretation. Ultimately, we re-enter the light world no sooner than we endeavor to become the best versions of ourselves. But more often than not, this requires that we first become acquainted, or sometimes reacquainted, with the worst versions of ourselves, thereby enabling us to assess our strengths and weaknesses honestly, and encouraging us to favor those tools which empower us most readily. This is a pretty thankless job at times. After all, no one really wants to be a monster, even if only partially and temporarily. But the good news is that once we have explored this darkness long enough and cannily enough to have awakened the light within ourselves, others tend to follow, or at the very least to cease being obstacles. So let's recap. This act of coming together, this, not this liberates us from the dark world. When spiritual and mundane powers alike are gathered and activated, when peoples unite, when bonds are strengthened and differences put aside. as though waking up from a dream or a nightmare. Peace is restored. Prosperity is renewed. Hope is rekindled. At least for a while. For how long? Well, that really depends on three things. Things which ought to be valued in equal measure. To maintain the golden era, we must maintain our courage, that is, our purity of heart and our willingness to take a stand and defend what is sacred and beloved. We must also maintain our power, that is, our willingness to foster preparedness, strength, and skill within a community for the betterment of all. And we must maintain our wisdom, that is, our receptivity to new information and our willingness to recognize patterns, to refine judgments, and to learn from past mistakes. And, once more, this process begins within the self. Link, and indeed the player, can neither enter nor bring others into the sacred realm without first traversing the darkness. From thence are reclaimed the pearls of courage, power, and wisdom.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked this video, I have a lot of other similar content on this channel.